Today, I am talking with one of Australia's top legal experts when it comes to religious freedom and family law, and that is Professor Patrick Parkinson. He's going to break down for us the changes and what it is we're facing as Christians, how to navigate that wisely with wisdom, with grace, when to speak up, when maybe to be a little bit more quiet. What does this mean for churches, Christian organizations, and schools? How do we navigate all this changing landscape? And what actually are laws and how does that work through Parliament? And what does this mean for our future? This conversation might sound bleak, but actually it's the opposite. It's really hope filled. I love Patrick's perspective and understanding in this space. Make sure you subscribe on here on YouTube to stay up to date with all things her theology. Now let's get stuck into the episode. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time. You're coming to us from beautiful Tassie, so that's fun.
A pleasure.
How long have you been the British accent gives it away. No one's heard you talk yet. But how long have you been in Australia for?
Since 1986, so it's a long time, close on 40 years.
So it's definitely home now.
It's definitely home. And I like visiting the UK. My family are there, but I would never want to live there.
Yeah. My mum is Dutch and I've never been to Europe. It's my dream. But we have 4 kids now. So that's like buying a small car just to get us there and back. But I always say to her, I'm like, why didn't you ever want to move back? She's like, nope, couldn't do it. No, Australia is just too beautiful. I was like, oh, good to know. Maybe she made the right decision.
I think Britain's very crowded now. Population just expanded and expanded.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your book. I mentioned it off air, but it was very insightful and helpful for me. And those of you that are listening that are new to her theology, maybe you're unfamiliar with her theology and what I talk about on here, but I talk a lot about culture, society, and what it looks like to be a Christian in a world that is growing in polarization against Christian ethics, morals, and teachings. What the Bible says pretty much. And so we talk about a range of topics on this podcast, from transgender to abortion to just life in general. Like, how do we do life as Christians in this world? How do we be in the world but not of the world? What does it look like to walk out our faith? And part of that is talking about these tricky subjects. And sometimes when we talk about these tricky subjects, there's a lot of legalities we need to be mindful of, because there are a lot of law reforms that are taking place in Australia that is changing, I guess, the ethos of the Australian culture and society and the way we value, more importantly, human life and how that plays out into every day. And it's really impacting and infiltrating every aspect of day-to-day life, from healthcare, education, through to just even family law and things like that. So Patrick's book is a wealth of knowledge on how to navigate all of this, because it's so tricky, Patrick. You know, as I was reading your book, I think you mentioned in there, on average, there's 140 laws that are introduced each year in Australia, on average.
Oh, like, there's a lot more than that, Cass. That would be a single parliament.
Oh, that blew my, like, what? How is that even possible? Like, how can, what? I don't understand. Like, as someone that is completely and utterly not versed in anything legal in law, what do you mean there's more than that? Like, how do we come up with that many laws a year?
Well, there's a federal parliament, there's 6 states and there's 2 territories, and they're all busy amending laws. And then beneath the laws that are passed are regulations, which can run to thousands and thousands of pages each year. So, yeah, it's a big business keeping up with it all.
And I feel like they're quite sneaky sometimes, changing laws. Is that right? Like, it does feel like they change stuff. You know, I don't know. I feel like, oh, we're a democracy, we should know what's going on. But lately, there's been a lot of changes that I think have been quite sneaky. Can you share any of those? Like, what would be some of the ones that have been kind of sweep that underneath quickly while no one's looking?
Sneaky is a pejorative word. I mean, if you are in agriculture, fish farming or something, you probably know about the laws which affect fish farming when they change. But laws which affect the general population, it's hard for anybody to keep up with them unless there's a lot of publicity around them, and that's where you can get trapped. I was chair for a long time of Freedom for Faith, a group I thoroughly recommend to everyone. Freedom for Faith keeps on top of the religious freedom issues as best we can in state, territory, and federal law, and that's a good way to know what's happening in the religious freedom space.
Yeah, and that keeps you up to date with those things that are changing that are relevant.
And it allows you to campaign against change.
So with all these laws that change or are introduced each year, once a law's put into place, can it be changed?
Yes, it can, but just going to federal politics for a moment, you have a lower house which is reliant upon who's won the election, who's got the most seats. So now it's a Labour government, has been coalition government. But the Senate is a much more mixed bag. You've got very rarely do you have a situation where the majority in the lower house has a majority in the Senate as well. It's almost rare as hens stick. It's happened under John Howard in his last term. But you're reliant on the support of the Greens and various independents here and there. What it means is that once a law has passed and got through the Senate, changing it is quite difficult because you've got to form another coalition within the Senate to overcome and amend that law. That's why a lot of bad laws remain unchanged, because there's just not the consensus in the Senate to pass major changes to them.
So we're talking about in specific, and in your book, it's really emphasizing religious freedom and how law reforms are changing the ability to play out our faith in various ways, whether that be within the family life, the church, etc. What would be some of the laws that are currently in that place of trying to be pushed through, but maybe haven't gotten through yet? What are some of the things that we need to be aware of as Christians in regards to Australia's current push for different law reforms?
There's a lot of different things happening. I think the number one issue is the right of religious organizations, faith-based organizations of every kind, to have schools and other organizations which are staffed by people who share their faith. Take Christian schools. A number of Christian schools, a lot of Christian schools want to have every staff member who is a committed believer, or at least all the teachers, if at all possible. The Catholic school system, which is a very, very large system, they have certainly a preference to have committed Christian teachers and otherwise staff who will adhere to the values of the school system. That is under threat. It's been under threat for some considerable time. And it is existential for us, because if we can't have Christian organizations which allow us to employ Christian staff and follow Christian values, then the Christian school is no different from the school next door. And there's been a push for years. So let me explain where it's coming from. Anti-discrimination laws are there in every state and territory, and also some laws in the federal government as well. And they basically say, thou shalt not discriminate. But thou shalt not discriminate is far too much of a blanket statement. Women's group needs to be able to discriminate, to employ women. You don't expect an environmental group to employ people who don't believe in climate change. There's a million ways in which you do discriminate and should do. A political party doesn't have to choose as candidates somebody from the opposite political persuasion, and so on and so forth. So a lot of religious exemptions which have been there as well, and been largely uncontroversial. Why is it that anti-discrimination law has nothing to say about whether women can be Catholic priests? Because there's a religious exemption which says that the ordination of clergy is a matter for the religious organization to determine. But these religious exemptions have come under more and more pressure. There's been real efforts to wind them back. There's a belief that any exemptions really are prima facie immoral unless they can be justified in some particular way, special measures for disadvantaged groups, that kind of thing. And so there's been this strong resistance to religious exemptions and gradual winding back in the various states and territories. The other big change is that anti-discrimination laws have expanded and expanded and expanded. Let me give you a hair-raising example from north of New South Wales, from Queensland. Last year, anti-discrimination law was changed to make it a ground for discrimination that you discriminate against somebody on the basis of their sex work, prostitution. But not just prostitution, any engagement in videos that show off your body. You may have heard of OnlyFans.
I just did an episode on OnlyFans.
I will say no more. Imagine a situation, and this has happened in the United States, I can tell you this.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a situation where a female teacher has a part-time gig on OnlyFans, which involves her undressing, etc. Kids at the school get hold of some still photograph shoots, stills of that OnlyFans site. They get circulated throughout the school. You could imagine that a school principal would be extremely unhappy about that situation. But he or she couldn't do anything about it without breaching anti-discrimination laws. And the Christian school principal is not in a much better position in Queensland than the secular one. Why? Because the only religious exemptions under that law apply to matters in the course of your employment, things that you do in the course of your work as a teacher. What you do at the weekends or in the evenings on OnlyFans is none of the school's business. And this is how anti-discrimination law has expanded in ways that I don't think attract wide public acceptance at all. You use the word sneaky, I would agree. I was one of the few people to protest against those changes. It was all done in the name of human rights. And here's the thing, Cass. We, as Christians, were in the forefront of anti-discrimination laws back in the 60s and 70s. Who was the leader of the civil rights movement in the United States? The Reverend Martin Luther King. And Christians have been very supportive of all measures to promote equality, to oppose discrimination on the grounds of age, sex, disability, and so on and so forth. Sexual orientation issues, gender identity, a bit more difficult and controversial. But broadly speaking, we support anti-discrimination laws. And we do so because we say that it is completely wrong to discriminate on the basis of unchosen attributes. You can't help the race and ethnicity that you were born with. You can't help it. In most cases, if you have a disability, certainly a permanent ongoing disability, you can't change your sex. That may be controversial now, but you get my point. But when you start talking about choices, such as people going on OnlyFans, either as consumers or as producers, that's not an issue on which we should have laws which prohibit how other people respond. And these are some of the issues that we are facing in Australia, and we're seeing them in other parts of the world also.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you were saying, Christians have been, at the forefront of wanting, speaking out against discrimination. I think the Bible's clear. There's no slave, no free, no Gentile, no Jew. We are all united in Christ. That's the beauty of the gospel. So I find it really fascinating that it seems to be all in line with sex. Like it seems to be so closely related every single time to gender and sexuality. It's like it has become this demigod that society holds up as the ultimate. I mean, since postmodernism, we don't have any absolute truth, but sex and gender and sexuality are ultimate truth for society. Sometimes that's what it feels like. I'm not saying that necessarily people would say that, but it feels like that. Like, why is it because it's the only thing they can push this stuff through with? Or is it like, why? Why is that the case?
I think it's part of a broader picture. I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, sex and gender have become really center stage in a lot of public policy. But it's a broader thing about I can be whatever I want to be. I can do whatever I want to do as long as the other person in the sexual relationship gives consent and they're old enough to do so. And nobody can tell me what I do with my body. Nobody can tell me how I live my life. And how dare you do so? And that conflicts directly with Christian morality. Of course, we don't go around judging people and condemning people. We don't do that. But the very existence of Christian morality stands as a challenge for the idea that I can do whatever I want with my body, do whatever I want with my life. No, we say that we are made for a purpose and that there are moral boundaries around some of those things. And that's been ever since the 1960s. It's a big clash.
It's so true, because the sexual revolution was the complete opposite of that, wasn't it?
And we're now at the tail end of it. We're at these sort of the ultimate end game for the sexual revolution, and people are desperately unhappy.
Yeah.
It's not made us happier. The amount of confusion there is in the younger generation around dating, around sex, what's right, what's okay, what's going to lead to a complaint of sexual harassment or misconduct in the workplace. All of these sorts of issues are making people very unhappy, but people don't know another moral framework in which to build relationships successfully.
Because you mentioned that it's people are wanting to define what their own truth is, what to justify the way in which they live life, which I also think is really interesting, because we're introducing these laws and thinking about it in light of, well, I just want to live my life the way I want to, and I need it validated through these laws that, it's okay to do so. But in doing that and wanting that for our own life, we're doing it at the expense of other people's convictions and morality and whatnot. And so I find it confusing, because it's what they want. And when I say they, like, as in the ones that are submitting these changes, they want freedom to exercise however they want their sexual identity, their whatever it may be, however they want to live their lives. But at the same time, they're introducing the government having more control and having more say and infiltrating other parts of our life. That's the way it seems to me. Is that right or wrong?
It is, and it's more with some issues than with others. This is why the transgender issue has been so difficult, because sexual orientation doesn't make any demands on anybody else other than the person or the couple. But gender identity does. It's not just that you are free to believe you're female or identify as female even though you are male. It's that the law now and the culture is increasingly requiring other people to accept that you are the gender that you identify with. And that's irrespective of whether your gender identification goes back to early childhood, as with a few people it does, or whether it's something you adopt as a teenager, particularly teenage girls, or it's something which arises out of very serious mental illness. In all of these situations, we are meant to affirm the gender identity of the person. So it directly impacts upon other people. And this is directly impacting particularly on women in terms of single-sex spaces and changing rooms and sports.
So is this, okay, I'm going to say this, I'm going to play, I am a Christian. I'm a conservative Christian. And so I hear a lot within my circles, and I too have said this. I'm guilty of this. I will be fully clear that I'm like, it's communism or it's socialism. Don't really know what those terms mean. So, you throw these blanket terms around. But if I'm being real, half the time I'm like, I don't actually really know what I'm talking about. Why am I saying that? I probably shouldn't say that. I should just keep my mouth shut. I don't say it publicly. I have said it publicly now. But normally that's just within my friend circles. But my question to you is, we live in a democratic state. So we have democracy. We vote things in. Those that are in power, we choose, we vote them in. And I'm sure there's much more to it. What is communism and socialism? That's a big question. But in relation to law, like, what's the differences between, say, our country and then communist state countries or socialist countries? what's the difference when it comes to laws being made and how that impacts life? Because I think I want to get some truth for us and get us out of the muddy waters when we use these labels, because we're probably
Yeah,
using them incorrectly a little bit.
I think so. You will know because you've read my book that I spent 9 months in Czechoslovakia during the communist era. It was a very formative time for me, eye-opening time. But in that time, law was the servant of government and nothing else. So the Communist Party was in power, and that was expressed through through law, and that was expressed through the police, and it was expressed through the courts. So you couldn't possibly be a lawyer, and certainly not a judge, without being a member of the Communist Party. And the idea that the courts would be independent of government would just be nonsense. My Christian friends could not understand how I could be a Christian and be a lawyer. They simply couldn't understand it because it was a profession completely closed to them. So that's what a communist and socialist system does. A communist system anyway. It uses law as an instrument of government power. Now, as soon as I've said that, you can see how this is a matter of degree rather than anything else.
Mm.
Because in a situation, and let's be honest, Victoria is a good example of this currently in Australia, where you've had one government in power for a very long time that's pretty much unchallenged by the opposition, and has also got enough votes to get things through the upper house quite easily. Then the conditions for despotism are there even in a democratic society. And I think we've seen that in Victoria under Premier Dan Andrews, under his successor, the use of law and police authority and power to enforce an ideological position on the society.
Mm. So are we at you know how people say, I've heard many people say, if we keep on this trajectory, we'll end up being a communist country or a communist state or whatever. Is that actually a risk? Like, is that a legitimate concern for people to have? Or is it just an exaggerated, media-driven uh, kind of blanket statement that we use?
I'm not sure it's a very useful discourse, to be honest, because the other thing about communism or the socialist countries of Eastern Europe and Russia, as it was before the Iron Curtain,
Mm.
they concentrate economic power
Yeah.
within the state. So, certainly when I was in Czechoslovakia during the communist regime, there were no private businesses. You could not have a private business. There were limits on private property. So this is a much bigger issue. Communism, Marxism is all about the concentration of economic power in the state on behalf of the
Government.
working class, as it were. And we're just not in that world anymore. What is important, though, I think, without getting into labels, is to realize that we are, in Australia, but also in many other countries, complex, multicultural societies. That we have a great range of people with different backgrounds, different faiths, no faith at all, different ethnicities, different cultural norms. And we have to hold together that multicultural society by living and letting live.
Mm.
And sorts of changes to laws I'm talking about are where one group, one set of interests is trying to impose its values on a great many other people and not allowing diversity of viewpoint, particular moral issues in the community as a whole. And that's a recipe for disaster because we're not going to become less multicultural. In fact, over the next 20 years in Australia, the religious diversity of our population is going to increase considerably. Why? Because a lot of our immigration is from the Islamic world. Increasingly, it's from Africa. There's some very strong Christian communities there. And people of faith are having babies.
Yep.
And people who don't have a faith are having babies at a much lesser rate. And so demographically, the population is going to change. And it's therefore very important for governments to think in the long term about how we hold all these different cultures together in a harmonious whole. And it does not involve suppressing religious freedom.
Yeah. So, on the note of suppressing religious freedom, what comes first? Is it the suppression of religious freedom or uh, the slow removal of religion? So, you think of we find ourselves in a postmodern society. It's quite secular, the Western world. So, are we finding that religious freedom is being tightened and pushed back on and trying to be eliminated because we're less religious? Does that make sense? Like,
Yes,
which
it does. It makes sense, but I think it's not because we are less religious, it's because the elites are less religious.
Mm,
Those who dominate government, public service, the universities, some of our major corporations, there is a very strong secularization trend, has been for a long time, within those groups. As a Christian at university in law schools, I was in a small minority, certainly as a public Christian, and so that has meant that those who are making these decisions, those who are the real influencers and drivers, they don't care nearly as much about religion as they would have done, say, 30 years ago. And the decline in church attendance has had knock-on effects for religious freedom because, you know, decades ago, the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne just had to pick up the phone to the Premier, and if there was a real issue, the Premier would take notice. That doesn't happen anymore to nearly the same extent. Again, it's about the amount of confidence the government has in getting its own laws through despite opposition to them. In a situation where an election is going to be coming in a year where, the polls are showing 50-50, 49-51 sort of division, governments are cautious because they need all the votes. But in situations where they feel confident, or in situations like Queensland, where there is no upper house, there's just a lower house, then they can erode religious freedom much more easily.
mm, interesting. Yes. So, part of religious freedom is freedom of speech. Being able to join in conversation in the public square to voice what it is we believe, why we believe it, why we think it's good for society. And that is on a range of different topics that impact people in the day to day. But what is the law looking like for us in regards to hate speech? I'm asking because I'm very mindful of the UK, where I read a stat recently. I don't know if it was completely correct, but it was over 5,000 people have been arrested or, you know, um, given warnings at the very least to take their comments offline as hate speech. It just seems to be getting out of control in some countries. I'm curious where Australia's at with that and what that looks like for us as Christians to act wisely, but also still speak truth. What's your thoughts?
First thing to say is that Britain has had a very serious problem in this area.
Yeah.
And just in the last week or two, the police have announced that they are no longer going to be continuing the practice that they have had of knocking on doors and recording instances of non-criminal hate speech, it's called, on a non-criminal hate instance.
So
This,
good.
well, yes, I mean, they should have realized this a long time ago. The police don't have to investigate every alleged crime. Just because an activist says, "Oh, you must go and arrest so and so," they've said something bad. Police have always had a discretion about how they allocate their resources, and they've allocated them in some cases and some police command areas, I think, very unwisely over the last few years. But that's a matter of history, and that's a matter of the UK. I think we're seeing changes moving forward. The other point to make about hate speech laws is that these are not directed against Christians.
Mm,
And it's very important to say that because what happens is that Christians can be caught up in broader cultural war issues by what they say on certain subjects. Now, it is antithetical to any idea of Christianity that we should engage in language which incites violence or which expresses hate. We should be reasonable, moderate, kind in what we say and how we say it. So I've got no sympathy for people who are just rabble rousers in the name of Christ. I think they are following the wrong book. But having said that, there are huge issues on which freedom of speech is important. We've talked about the transgender issue, which is an issue I've been very involved with as well. It's really important that we can calmly, rationally, and with reference to science, debate these issues and what impact they have on, or should have on laws and on public policy. And while by and large that is true, we can do that. It's increasingly becoming accepted to cancel people, to report them to police, and so we saw this in Scotland. They introduced a new hate speech law. It was very controversial. Actually, the Scottish Parliament had wound it back considerably by the time it got passed. But I think I got the figures in the book. There's something like this. They had about 7,000 or 8,000 complaints in the first week after that law came into effect.
Crazy.
That takes the police away from dealing with violent crime, dealing with burglaries, dealing with property theft, dealing with shoplifting, dealing with all the other, dealing with sexual assaults. The police ought to be concentrating on those things. So this is the downside of hate speech laws, is that if you're using the criminal law, then you are stretching police resources ever more thinly. If you're using the civil law, making it a ground for compensation, for example, that somebody has said things to you which have offended you, as happens in Tasmania, then you are undermining the credibility of law. And you're also wasting a lot of resources which would be better spent on other things.
So what does it look like in Australia? Like, should we be more mindful about how we're speaking publicly on social media and all that? Or is it not that bad here yet? Or not going to be?
I think it's not that bad here yet. Public enemy number one in Australia is not the Christian church, it's the gender critical feminists. If you want to know what persecution is looking like, you see what happens with gender critical feminists.
Really? I need to look into this. Okay.
There was even a completely mad thing which happened in the university world, both in Australia and in England. The Tertiary Education Union, which should always stand up for academic freedom, said, we stand up for academic freedom for everybody except gender critical feminists. How do you do that? How do you do that in the name of academic freedom? So these are some of the things. Look, as Christians, we should always speak responsibly, kindly, generously, with love for others. We need to be guided in our lives by the Sermon on the Mount. We are not called by God to engage in some sort of Twitter war or TikTok war on these things. Yes, we must speak out on certain issues. The way we do so is really very important.
Don't be a keyboard warrior, they call them.
Don't be a keyboard warrior. There is a place for that, but not in the sort of aggressive, offensive way that a lot of that conversation occurs.
Yeah, I like someone said it the other day, you know, I'm always going to be aggressive to speak out against the ideology, but always compassionate, gracious, kind when I'm speaking to an individual, when I'm speaking to people, because everyone has their own story that's unique and, you know, they are still an image bearer of God. And I was like, it's a really good way of thinking it through, you know, and how do we do that well?
And I think being careful even about being aggressive against the ideology, because that become a bit of a straw man, a bit of a
okay.
exaggeration of what is going on. If you talk to people on the other side of the debate, there'll be very often, if not usually, good and valid reasons why they think as they do. There may be some research behind it. In other words, it could be a much more nuanced position than the culture war gives you the impression there is. Sometimes not, but usually there is. And I think we need to get beyond the whole left-right of politics on these issues and recognize that those terms are no longer very, very helpful.
Well, I've been feeling this myself because the division, when Charlie Kirk passed away, was killed, um, you could feel the tension, of the division it felt like it was already there and now it's here, and we have these defining moments in history that makes it feel like we're just getting further and further apart. And I find it hard as a Christian to navigate that landscape because I absolutely disagree with what these people are promoting and saying. When someone's like dancing on the grave of someone, I'm like, ew, no, that's evil. Don't do what are you doing? Don't do that. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, how do I navigate this as a Christian? Because it can make you angry and it can make you inflamed. And I don't want to add to this. But at the same time, we are so opposed to what the world preaches. So it's just, yeah, it obviously I don't have an answer. I don't know what I'm asking, but I just feel like I feel the tension that's there, the discernment that's needed, the wisdom that's needed, and we just don't have that sometimes.
And what did Jesus say? Blessed are the peacemakers.
Mm,
That is a really important framework for thinking about these issues. Years ago, in the whole same-sex marriage debate, I had a dialogue with a very prominent LGBT leader. I won't name who it was, but we together worked on a bill to change the Marriage Act, which would allow for same-sex marriage while protecting religious freedom in the fullest way possible. And the basic idea of it was there's two sorts of marriage. There's civil marriage, which is a marriage between two people, and there is religious marriage, if that's what you believe, that marriage is between a man and a woman. And this was a live and let live approach to the problem. We got a long way. We got a long way with leaders of the LGBT movement, a long way with Christianese. In the end, we couldn't bring that compromise to bear. And the result was that when the referendum, or postal survey as it was called, eventually happened, we were in a much worse negotiation position around issues of religious freedom than we would have been had the efforts that I made with that other person borne through. This is, I think, a key thing to how we approach these issues. Theme for Faith have been in the vanguard of many of these debates. What we do is try to be constructive the whole time and say, okay, there's an issue here. There is a strong view about this. We have a different view. Let's see if we can find a way to meet in the middle, or to allow each to have a win, or to allow live and let live in this situation. And generally, I've found that people have been reasonable when you've had that sort of conversation.
yeah, that's
Sometimes you get something through, sometimes you don't. But the conversation at least is respectful and constructive, even if the outcome's not always what we want it to be.
it's a bit of a mind shift, isn't it? Not wanting to win the argument, but to actually, well, in James, slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen. Very easy to read that, very hard to actually put that into practice sometimes.
Yeah, and other statements, don't get involved with useless quarrels.
Yes. Yep.
And what is fundamental, 1 Timothy 2, that we pray for those in authority, we may live quiet and godly lives, and that have the freedom to share the faith. That's fundamental. Everything else is secondary.
So how do we do that? How do we as Christians, as restrictions may come in place? We saw that during COVID. We saw that in different situations. I'm thinking of conscientious objectors, like in the medical health world. There's lots of different scenarios where Christians find themselves in where they may feel like they need to break the law. Uh, how do we navigate that wisely? And I'm asking you to summarize a very large portion of your book, which I'm well aware in. So I am going to take a second here to say, if you are a church leader, even just everyday Christian like myself, it doesn't matter where you find yourself. This book is very helpful, getting you to slow down and step by step think through how to respond. But just as a general, what would be your advice when it comes to laws and learning from history and whatnot?
Well, first of all, I think you need to change the language of breaking the law,
Mm.
which is much more complex than that. Take anti-discrimination law. Tasmania and Victoria are two states where there are very, very limited exemptions for Christian organizations or any
I
faith-based organization.
as
So
well.
yeah. So
Right.
you live within you live on a narrow ledge when it comes to religious freedom to employ staff. And what that means is that there may be situations where um, not so much with employing staff, because I think there's a range of reasons why you might pick one person out of a short list of 5 that you've interviewed. And one of them is conformity with the values and beliefs of the organization. You're going to choose somebody who's going to fit. So I think generally with employing staff, we're not in too bad a position. But what can happen is that somebody goes through changes in their lives. They no longer believe what they did, and maybe entering into a relationship which is known and which is against the code of conduct of the school or wherever it is. And so you may be faced as a Christian leader or head of a Christian organization with the prospect of a legal dispute. So you see why I'm not talking about breaking the law. I'm
Mm.
talking about a situation where law rises up and may become a problem for you. Well, the first thing you do is you read the Sermon on the Mount. What does it say? It says, settle quickly with your adversary. And in a situation where it's nobody's fault, this woman, this man has changed what they believe, what their values are, their things, and they no longer are well suited to the job that they hold. They probably realize that. The school realizes that. You don't have to make this an adversarial fight. You don't have to thump the table with your morality. You just have to recognize that there's an issue that needs to be resolved, and the kinder, more generous and respectful you are about how you go about that, the more likely you are to resolve the issue. If that means offering a generous payment of some kind to help them move on with their lives and find another job, that's what you need to do. Now, contrast that with a situation where the threat of a lawsuit is simply vexatious. One of the most extraordinary examples of this I had was I was talking to the leaders of a Christian welfare organization. Do great work in caring for victims of violence and the poorest in our society. And it was like all those organizations. It employs a great range of staff, but it insists that its senior leadership are all believers. Well, this woman applied for an entry-level position where faith was not an issue. Whatever faith there was fine. And before applications had closed, she put in a complaint of discrimination. Now, I don't know what's going on there. It sounds to me like somebody's either being vexatious for ideological reasons or more likely just wanting to see if they can get a quick payout.
Yeah.
And in those sorts of situations, we have to oppose it. And we have to oppose it sometimes at great cost, because we cannot allow ourselves to be blackmailed by vexatious litigants.
Mm. You mentioned as well, like the power of staying silent.
Mm.
Like, I think I've always thought I have to give an answer, but we don't have to give an answer. Is that correct? Like, most.
It is. I mean, here's the first thing to say, Cass. Law relies almost entirely on voluntary compliance.
Mm.
We obey the law because we feel we ought to, because we accept that, broadly speaking, it's good. We may disagree in the levels of detail. You may be absolutely infuriated by that 40 speed limit in a place where you really don't need it to be 40, or when it drops from 80 to 60 for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
And look, okay, there are speed cameras around, but by and large, we accept that the law is good. As Christians, we should accept the law is good. And by and large, we comply. So in a situation where a law is passed, which really we cannot comply, good example is in Victoria, where the government is now prescribing what we are allowed to pray for.
Yes.
This is a red line.
Anti-conversion bill, if no one's familiar with it. It's
Yeah,
very
yeah, good conversion therapy. And there's a website where the Human Rights Equal Opportunity Commission sets out what we're allowed to pray for, what we can't pray for, even on our own.
and even in your own head, isn't it?
Even on your own.
I actually, when I read it and heard about it, I laughed. I thought it was the funniest thing I've ever. I'm like, I'm sorry, you're trying to regulate what I pray in my head.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
you go
yeah.
do that.
And by the way, the law does not say that at all. So this is overreach by a quasi-government body, a government body. Whatever the issue is about praying for this, that, or the other, we don't comply with those laws. We cannot do so. And there will be other situations, increasingly perhaps, where quiet non-compliance is the way. We don't tell anybody. We just don't do what we've been told to do if it restricts the practice of our faith. There are other situations where civil disobedience is got to be public and act as a challenge to government. And there's a long history in Christian thought of the right of civil disobedience, even the right of revolution. If you go back to people like Aquinas and some of the other thinkers, they say, well, government's ordained by God, but if government is opposed to God, well, then our duty to obey is limited. It's far more complex than that. But in a situation where you want to protest against laws, then doing so publicly with the intention of getting arrested is probably what you may feel that you need to do. Good example is the apartheid laws in South Africa. Christians were in the forefront of demonstrations against apartheid laws in the name of equality. And they not only risked being arrested or punished, that was how they were protesting. So we need to think about, well, what do we mean by complying with the law? Do we just not comply quietly? Do we do so overtly? But in a situation where we are asked about what we are doing, or the police interview us, well, we have the right to remain silent. That's a fundamental legal principle. And that's why before the police interview you, they say you have the right to remain silent. I think you said, but what you say will take down evidence for you against you. Similar formula everywhere. They mean that. And you have the right to remain silent, and you do. And in a situation where the government is trying to enforce an unjust law, the less help you give them to do so, the better.
You gave a lot of actual examples in your book of how that played out. I think reading your book was helpful for me because I hear of all these people being charged or, taken to court, but actually a lot of the times it kind of just falls flat because I didn't realize how much it's more scare tactics and it doesn't actually hold up when you put it in line with all the other human rights and laws and things that are out there to protect us from unfair charges. I mean, of course, people still can, but it was helpful to bring it back down to earth and go, oh, it's not as bad as it necessarily seems.
And it's important to emphasize it's not just human rights laws and so on that are there. It's also resource constraints. The courts are overloaded with work. Prosecutors are overloaded with work. There are sometimes in some states and territories long delays before you can get to trial. And some of those delays mean that people are in prison on remand. They haven't been convicted. They haven't been given bail, so they are awaiting trial. And so if you're thinking about the issues as the Minister for Justice or in charge of the prosecution system, you've got to pick which cases you run. You must have a reasonable prospect of success. That's a fundamental rule. Prosecutors should not bring charges forward unless they have a reasonable prospect of success. And so it'll be not uncommon for the police to interview, decide not to lay charges, or even if there are charges, the prosecution will say, we're not proceeding with that. And that's what's happened with the hate speech laws in the UK. There've actually been very few prosecutions,
Yeah.
other than in the riots after the Southport killings. You may remember the little children who were murdered. Taylor Swift's dance
Mm.
studio of some kind. That was a tragic and awful situation. Riots broke out, and there were a number of people prosecuted then. But by and large, neither in Australia nor elsewhere do we see many prosecutions based upon certainly what people say.
Yeah. Agreed. So I had to ask on that note, actually, no. What does the future look like for Australia? Like you paint, I've written on my notes, but didn't write down his name. You use the story, the little sermon, the talk that the Archbishop gave. It was an exaggeration, a bit of fun to, we're in 2035 and this is what this dystopian future looks like. Submitting our prayers to the, regulation and whatnot. Uh, but it was interesting to think through, what do you think the future does look like for us? Is it as bleak as we think? I don't know.
Well, the first thing to say is that nobody's going to stop you going to church. Nobody's going to interfere with your freedom of worship. Why? Because nobody cares what I do on a Sunday morning. I can play video games, I go to church, who cares? So there is that. But I think the trend in the last many years has been that it's increasingly difficult to be a Christian in the workplace.
Mm.
And I'm particularly conservative Christian, holding conservative values. I certainly experienced that, and a lot of other people have as well. And we must resist the temptation to be silent believers. There is a culture which says we bring our whole selves to work. Well, as Christians, we have to bring our whole selves to work as well. It doesn't mean that we put Bible fondly on our desk or, posters saying you must be saved, repent now and go to hell. You don't do any of that. But we must resist the pressure to be intimidated into being secret about our faith. What's the long-term prognosis? You were referring to a talk given by Archbishop Fisher, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, a very, very fine man, a very fine talk, in which he postulates that in his final year as Archbishop, he's having to submit his sermons to the government for approval. I don't think we're going there, and I'm less pessimistic than I was 3 years ago.
That's good.
But the trend has been there. The trend has been there to increasing control over what we say and what we do, even through sermons. I tell enough stories in the book that you would see that certain people who have crossed boundaries around talking about LGBT issues have faced very significant pressures, lost their jobs, and so on. And there may be other issues which arise in the future. Abortion is another one, where the expression of Christian views could get you into serious trouble. So there is an ever-present need to push back, to make governments pay a political price when they restrict our freedoms, whether it's freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of association. Those are the 4 fundamental freedoms. Whenever governments restrict our rights, often they do so in the name of human rights, which is just appalling. We need to make them pay a political price at the ballot box.
So you're saying those 4 principles, where do they come from? Are they just basic human rights? Where does human rights is thrown around an awful lot, that term.
Yeah.
But where does it actually come from? I think you mentioned the is it ICCPR or something?
Yes.
Yeah.
The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, very, very broadly accepted, 1966 covenant. And that built upon the Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which was in the aftermath of World War II. So these are very widely accepted principles. Lots of people claim human rights for lots of things, but the ICCPR, that international covenant, is the foundation of widely accepted rights. The thing is that rights very rarely happen in isolation. The
Mm.
right to torture is one which happens in isolation almost by definition. That is, it doesn't conflict with any other rights. The right to be free from torture ought to be applicable to everybody in every situation. But most rights have some conflicting right. So freedom of speech is rightly limited in certain ways. You can't defame people and so on. Freedom of association, well, it depends. If you want to have 1 million people crossing the harbour bridge all at once, the police may say, I'm sorry, this isn't safe. So there's all sorts of ways in which rights are restricted, either in competition because they're in competition with other rights, or because they're in conflict with public safety or some other rational reason. So people talk about human rights as if there's somehow absolutes. I have a right to do this.
Mm.
Rarely is that the case. Even if you have a right which is recognized in the ICCPR, is likely to be limited in certain ways.
Yeah. And that's what I got out of your book as I'm reading it. I'm like, oh, this is way more complex than I ever realized. Because us non-academic, like as in haven't studied law, not in that space, we hear these terms, human rights and there's law reform and whatever, and we just think, oh, that's it now. That's the gold standard that we all have to adhere to. And then I realized, oh, there's so much to unpacking that because all these other laws play into that and how that works, and it's just a minefield, and so it's confusing, but it also gave me a lot of peace to go, "Okay, it's not all, hell in a handbasket as I thought it was."
No, I mean, God is in charge. God is in charge.
Absolutely.
Sometimes he saves you from the fire. Sometimes he saves you in the fire. Sometimes he doesn't save you. I'm afraid that's the history of the Christian church.
Yeah.
But in all things, we trust God, and we know he works for good,
Yeah.
and for his purposes. And that should give you a sense of peace and calmness about living your Christian life. The great majority of Christians in Australia will not experience persecution,
Mm.
will not experience the sorts of issues with the law that I talk about in my book. But if you're a Christian leader, if you're owning a Christian organization, chances are you will. And many of us may experience these pressures, and so need to understand how to be wise
Mm.
in responding to them.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Patrick, for your time. It's been really helpful for us to chew through. I definitely would recommend Patrick's book, Unshaken Allegiance. You can get that at Koorong and everything now, can't we? I'm pretty
Mhm,
sure it's all
mhm.
yeah, it's all out and everything. Yeah, yep. I was just checking. Koorong definitely has it, and all the other major book resellers. It's on Reform, Bookstore, and all that sort of stuff. So make sure you check that out. Patrick, where's best for people to find your work and what you do? Keep up to date with what you're doing.
Well, if your concern is religious freedom, I strongly recommend you sign up for the newsletter for Freedom for Faith. Um, I resigned from the board of that about a year ago. I can't remember exactly when. Why? Because God had answered my prayers to raise up many other fine people in that
Great,
will, and I want to pass the baton on to others.
great.
But I'm very involved with other work in public life, an organization called Publica, www.publica.org.au, where we're talking about how we strengthen families and communities. We've done a lot of work on loneliness, what that might mean for the churches. One of my themes, for example, I know has achieved a lot of traction, is that it's difficult to be single in a family-centric church. And there are ways in which we need to think about what we do as churches, but beyond churches, in public policy. What can we do about building strength in community? So that's Publica, of which I'm the executive director.
I will link both of those websites for you all in the episode notes so you can easily access that as well. Well, thank you, Patrick, again for your time. If this has been a helpful episode for any of you, please share it with your friends and family. That's the best way to get it out there and just help give us a bit of grounding and truth in the narratives that we hear out there in the media as well. It's easy to get swept up in that. And again, try and fight for that unity and that grace and the wisdom to know when to speak and when to listen. Slow to anger as well. So, enjoy your week, everyone, and I'll speak to you next week. Thank you again, Patrick.
Thank you, Cass.